Hello students. This week we're going to be working with seventh chords and their inversions. So I have to tell you what a chord is. So first of all, a triad is an example of a chord. So all chords contain multiple notes stacked on top of each other to be played at the same time in harmony. So remember dyads? Dyads were made of two notes and they were to be played at the same time. A dyad is an example of a chord. Now, most chords are not dyads. Most chords are either triads or seventh chords or some other kind of chord. But technically you could consider a dyad to be a chord sometimes. In most cases, chords are triads, which means they're made up of three notes played at the same time. But this week we're going to be looking at other kinds of chords called seventh chords, which contain more than three notes. They contain four notes to be played at the same time. I will explain to you in a little bit why they're called seventh chords. So, first of all, as you can see, very similarly to last week's assignment, you have these spaces along your staff to create chords. And instead of just creating three chords this time around, you're going to be creating four different chords. And that's because we're dealing with another type of inversion this week. So last week we dealt with root position, first inversion, and second inversion, because we were dealing with triads. But this week we're going to also be dealing with third inversion. And the only time you get to see third inversion is when you're working with seventh chords. Okay? And there is an extra credit, which you will see this week when you get your assignment. On our staff, as usual, there's 5 lines and 4 spaces. And here are the letters, once again, same as always. These letters will not be on the staff when you do your assignment this week. So please make sure you start to internalize these letters if you haven't done so already. Okay? Now, before we get into the seventh part of this, I just want to start to create an F chord in root position. So, root position is the same definition as when you're working with triads. It simply means that the bottom note is going to be on a line or space that is the same letter as the name of the chord. So the name of this chord is F7 chord. The letter is F. Disregard the 7 for a second. The letter is F, so that means the bottom note must be an F. We can either drag the note to the F on the space here or the F on the top line. I hope you'll agree it makes more sense to drag it to the bottom space so that we have room to work with above that. So here's my first bottom note on the F space. Okay? Now, if you recall from last week, I told you that triads, whenever you are creating a triad, you need to start by stacking the notes in intervals, I should say harmonic intervals, of thirds. So we have to figure out what is a third up from this F. So if we start with this space here where F is, and we count that as 1, then move up 1 step to the next line and count 2, and then move up to the next space and count 3. Since we're counting 3, that's a harmonic interval of a third, and the letter of that space where we have our third is A. So I want to drag my next note to the A space. You can also simply remember that the nickname for a third is a skip. So a skip is when we skip over a line, traveling from one space to another space, or skipping to a line, traveling from one line to another line and skipping over the space. Okay? So another term for a third is a skip. So we skipped from F to A, we skipped over G. Now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to skip from A to C, skipping over B. Now, normally if we were working with triads, we would stop there, and that would be an F triad chord in root position. But this week we're not working with triads. We are working with seventh chords. So now we need to keep going. We need to place our fourth note, a harmonic third above C. So a third above C would be a skip above C. So we would skip this line, and we would land on the E space, and that's where my fourth note will go. And here we have an F7 chord in root position. Okay? It's in root position because the bottom note is an F, and the name of our chord is F, and also all the notes are stacked in thirds. All the notes are stacked in harmonic thirds. There's a third between F and A third between A and C, and a third between C and E. Okay? Now, the reason why it's called an F7 chord is because this top note, only when you're in root position, this top note, E, is 7 steps away from the bottom note, F, or the root. F is the root because F is the bottom note. That's why they call it root position. F is the root. E is the 7th step away from F, the 7th note away from F. And we know that because if we counted F as 1, go up to G, that's 2, go to A, that's 3, go to B, that's 4, go to C, that's 5, go to D, that's 6, then when we finally arrive at E, that's 7. So we counted 7 steps from F to E, which makes this E note the 7th note from F in the F scale. Remember what a scale is when you go up or down the staff by steps? So if you were to play an F scale, you would go up 7 steps from F to E. That's what makes this a 7th chord. So this is an F7 chord because it contains the 7th note E. If we were to take away that note, then it would simply be an F triad in root position. Okay? So now that we have this information, we can go on to make inversions of our F7 chord. So first inversion is number 2. Create an F7 chord in first inversion. So first of all, what we should do is put our notes in root position, which is what you do every time before you invert them. So we're putting our 4 notes in root position just like we did with number 1. Okay? Now we need to put this F7 chord in first inversion. So what we need to know about first inversion is that instead of being stacked completely in thirds like root position, first inversion means that we're going to have a harmonic interval of a third on the bottom, a third in the middle, and a second on top. So I'll say that again. We're going to have a third on the bottom, a third in the middle, and a second on top. So we're going to have to do a little bit of playing around to figure out how we can achieve that. So we know this is not correct because we have a third on the bottom, a third in the middle, and a third on top. I want to make sure that we have a second on top. But this is the thing. We have to make sure that our F7 chord has the same exact letters in it, just like we were doing with triads. So I have to have an F, I have to have an A, I have to have a C, and I have to have an E. I'm going to be putting them in a different order, but I need to make sure I have those letters. So I can't have a D, okay? This looks like it's in first inversion because we have a third on the bottom, third in the middle, and a second on top. But this is not an F7 chord because there's no D in an F7 chord. So we have to figure out where else we could put these. We have to figure out where else we could put a note. Well, I have an idea. What if we took this bottom note and moved it to the top F? So basically I moved it from the bottom F to the top F. Okay, the low F to the high F. That looks very similar to what we had before. Let's see if this is correct. Okay, we do have the letter F, we have the letter A, we have the letter C, and we have the letter E. We have all the right letters, and let's see if it's in first inversion. Do we have a third on the bottom? A is 1, B is 2, C is 3. So yes, we do. Do we have a third in between our middle notes? Do we have a harmonic third in the middle? Let's see. C is 1, D is 2, E is 3. So yes, we have a harmonic third in the middle. Do we have a harmonic second on top? Well, if we count E as 1, and then we move up to F and count 2, since we counted the number 2, yes, that actually is a harmonic second on top. Okay? So number 2 is correct. All right? Now, let's move on to number 3. We're going to create an F7 chord in second inversion. So let's start with root position again. Now, second inversion is not going to have a third on the bottom and a third in the middle and a second on top. Instead, it's going to have a third on the bottom, a second in the middle, and a third on top. All right, so let's try to imagine how that might look. There's actually a couple different ways we could do this. I know that if I put an F on top instead of E, I'm just going to end up with first inversion again, and we don't want that. Okay? Now, what if I took the E and brought it down here? Would that be second inversion? Let's see. Do we have a third on the bottom? No, we don't. This is a second because if we count E as 1 and we move up to F, that's only 2. So we don't want a second on the bottom, we want a third on the bottom. So we tried moving the top note to a different E, and that didn't work. We tried moving the bottom note to a different F, and that didn't work. I know that if I move this A to someplace up here, that might be where it belongs, but then I'm going to also have to move something else because this is not a second in the middle or a third on top or a third on the bottom. So what I'm going to have to do is figure out where to put this note here. Okay? So I could leave it there. And I could also leave this E here, but what I would probably have to do is move this F up to here, but not just stop there. I would have to move this A up to here, which means I would have to create a ledger line with my marker tool, holding down the shift key. And then I would have to take my select tool, the arrow tool, and drag my bottom note up to here. So we have ourselves a high A. And that's a high A because this line here is an F. And what we're doing is we're skipping from this F to this ledger line. And because a skip is a third, that means we would count this note as F. This space between the F and the ledger line must be G, because G comes after F in the musical alphabet. And then the line above that space where G would normally be is A, because A comes after G in the musical alphabet. So now let's see if this is in second inversion. Do we have a third on the bottom? Is there a third between C and E? Yes, there is. C is 1, D is 2, E is 3. Now we have to have a second in the middle. Do we have a second between E and F? Yes, we do, because E is 1 and F is 2. That makes a second. Now we need a third on top. And as I just demonstrated, if you count F as 1, G as 2, and A, you get 3. So we do have a third on top. So that makes number 3 correct. Now let me show you how else you could do number 3. We're going to undo some of that. Now, instead of moving the A up there and the F up there, I could simply create a ledger line down here and drag my third space C down to this C, okay, which is lower on the staff. This is a lower C. It is off the staff on a ledger line, but going below the staff instead of above the staff, okay? Now we can leave this F here, we could leave this A here, but this E seems kind of out of place up here, so how about I move it down here? And there we go. So let's count the intervals here. Is there a third on the bottom between, oh, first of all, we need to know why this is a C. So here we have an E. As we move down the staff, we go backwards in the musical alphabet. So going from E down to the space here, the space, which would technically be a ledger space between E and this note, is D, because D is one letter backwards from E in the musical alphabet. Then if we were to go another step down to this ledger line, we would have to count another letter backwards from D, and that would be C. So this is C. Do we have an interval of a harmonic third between C and E? Yes, we do, because if you count C as 1, D is 2, and E is 3, you ended up at 3. So that's a third. And do we have a second in the middle? Yep, because between E and F, we have a second. E is 1, F is 2. 2 makes a second. Do we have a third between F and A? Yes, we do. F is 1, G would be 2, A is 3. So this answer is also correct. All I did was take all the notes from up here and move them down here. So they're all in their lower form, but it's still correct. They're in the same order as they were before, just in their lower form. And instead of using a ledger line up here, I ended up using a ledger line down here. Both answers would have been correct, okay? Now let's move on to number 4. We're going to create an F7 chord in third inversion. So let's start off with root position once again. All right, and again, we need to have these 4 letters in our chord, no matter what, F, A, C, and E. So third inversion involves having a second on the bottom, a third in the middle, and a third on top. Okay, so we have to imagine how we could invert this chord so that there's a second on the bottom. Well, I know I'm going to want an F, A, C, and E somewhere, okay? So like, I could pick a note at random and just move it down to this low E here, and that way I still have E and F, and there's a second between them, so I covered the requirement of having a second on the bottom, and I'm still using E and F, and I'm still using A, but now I'm left with this extra E that I don't need. I don't need 2 E's, I just need 1 E. So what are we missing? Are we missing F? No, F is here. Are we missing A? No, A is here. And we're not missing E because we actually have an extra E. We have E and E. So we're missing a letter. And if you're paying close attention, you'll know that the letter we're missing is C. Okay? We have a C in every chord, whether it's third space C or low C on the ledger line. So I'm going to take this extra E and move it down to the third space. So now I'm using C. And are we in third inversion? Do we have a second on the bottom? Yes, we do, because E is 1 and F is 2, and that makes a second. Do we have a harmonic interval of a third in the middle? Yes, because F is 1, then G would be 2, and A is 3. Do we have a harmonic interval of a third on top? Yes, because A is 1, B would be 2, and C is 3. So that makes a third. We have a second on the bottom, third in the middle, third on top. That's third inversion. I want to point out that, as you can see, whenever we have a harmonic interval of a second, the notes are like sort of one after the other, and they sort of look like melodic intervals, don't they? Because I told you in the past that a melodic interval is the distance between two notes that are played melodically, meaning they are one after the other instead of stacked. However, these notes, believe it or not, are actually stacked. They look like they're one after the other, but the reason why is because if I were to try to move the notes any closer, they would collide into each other, and it would look like that. And we don't want that. That's not correct, okay? So we never want to make the notes intersect like that and look like they're colliding. They have to be close to each other. They can even be lightly touching like that, but they can't cross, okay? Even if they're colored in. They have to look like that, okay? Now, if I moved it all the way over here, that would not be a harmonic interval because they're too far apart. They have to be close together, just not crossing over each other, okay? So this is a harmonic interval of a second. So is this, okay? I don't want to do that because then I'm going to be crossing over and colliding, okay? This is a harmonic interval of a second as well, okay? That's important. Now, we just warmed up with our F7 chords in different inversions, including root position. Now I want to go back and do a super duper undo because I want to show you what your homework is going to look like more or less, all right? So now we can actually leave our F7 chord in root position alone, okay? That's fine. But I'm going to change these up a little bit just so you get an idea. Okay? So now number 2 says create an E7 chord in first inversion. So let's practice that. We have to put the chord in root position first, but this time we can't just look at number 1 because number 1 is different. Number 1 is an F7 chord in root position. Number 2 is asking for an E7 chord in first inversion, but we're going to start with root position. So how do we put E7 in root position? Well, as I said before, root position means the bottom note has the same letter, or I should say the bottom note is on a line or space that has the same letter as the name of the chord, which is E in this case. So that means the bottom note has to be an E. Okay? Now, what else do you know about root position? You know that when the notes are in root position, that they all must be a third apart from each other. There must be harmonic thirds between all of them. So a harmonic third above E would be G. And a harmonic third above G would be B. And then we would have another third above B, which would be D. So as you can see, this looks very similar to number 1, except they're all on lines instead of spaces. Okay? So here's our E7 chord in root position, but now we need to put it in first inversion. First inversion means there has to be an interval of a third on the bottom, a third in the middle, and a second on top. And you have to use the same letters, E, G, B, and D. Well, I can tell you right now that if I move this bottom E up to the top space E, I've just created a second on top, and I'm still using E, and I didn't change any of the other notes. So that looks good. We have a third on the bottom between G and B, a third in the middle between B and D, and now we have a second on top between D and E. So that's our E7 chord in first inversion. Now, number 3 asks us to create a G7 chord in second inversion. So we have to start out in root position. So why am I putting the bottom note on the G line? Because it's a G7 chord, and the letter name is G. And when we're putting the notes in root position, we have to have the bottom note be on a line or space that has the same letter as the name, G7. So our bottom note is G, and then we have to place our next note a third above that, which would be B, once again. And then we have to place our next note a third above that, which would be D, once again. And then our final note would be a third above D, which is F. All right. Now, isn't it interesting that G7 in root position almost looks the same as E7 in first inversion? There's only one difference. This note is one step higher than that note. If I were to move this F down a step, I would be now in an E7 chord in first inversion. So it's amazing how that tiny little change can not only slightly change the way the chord looks, but it also changes its name altogether. It goes from being a G7 to an E7. All right, just a little interesting fact there. Now, let's put this chord in second inversion. Second inversion means we're going to have a third on the bottom, a second in the middle, and a third on top. So right now we have a third on the bottom, but we have a third in the middle. We need to make that into a second, but we have to use the same letters as usual, G, B, D, and F. We can't use different letters. We have to use the same letters that we have in root position, G, B, D, and F. So I could move this top F down to this bottom F, but if I do that, then I'm going to have a second on the bottom. So we can't just stop there. We have to make sure we have a third on the bottom and a second in the middle. So what if I moved this note down here? Now, why did I put it there? Let's see where it was originally. It was on the D line. So I have to find a lower version of D. And it's not written here, but if you can use your imagination to figure out what's one letter backwards from E in the musical alphabet, that would be D. And that D would go down here, one step below E. And that would be on a ledger space. It's on the ledge below the staff, on a ledger space. So here we have our ledger D. Okay, are we using the same letters that we should be using? Yes, because we have G over here, B over here. Now we have D down here, and we have F down here. Do we have a third on the bottom? Yes, we do, because you count D as 1, E would be 2, and F is 3, so that's a harmonic third. Do we have a harmonic second in the middle? Yes, because if you count F as 1 and G as 2, you end at 2, and that's a second. There is a second between F and G. Is there a third between G and B on top? Yes, because here we have G, that's 1, A would be 2, G is 3. We stopped on 3, so that's a harmonic third. Harmonic third on the bottom, second in the middle, third on top. That is second inversion. Now third inversion. And this time it's not a G7 chord, it's a C7 chord. So we have to start in root position. Well, I have a C up here, okay? I have a next note, one harmonic third above C. Now, to put a note a third above E, I would have to skip this line, because a third is considered a skip. So I'm skipping from this space over that line to this space, which is really a ledger space. So this note is on the ledge above the staff. And that's our high G, because one letter forward from F in the musical alphabet is G. E, F, G. Here we go. All right. Now I'm going to move this arrow over just for a minute so I can create some room, because we're not done. We got to put our last note a third above that, a third above G. So I know we're going to have to use a ledger line. So how about I draw a ledger line, and I'm going to draw it right above the G, okay? And let's see, what's a third above G? Well, we would have to skip this line, because if we were to put the note on that line, then we would only have a second, right? So I'm going to want to place this note above the ledger line. So that's another ledger space, because this note is sitting on a ledge, but it's just a smaller ledge. It's sitting on top of the ledger line. And let's see if we can figure out what letter that is. So we would have to move up a third from G. G is 1. What's one letter forward from A in the musical alphabet? It would have to be A, not H, but after G it starts over again at A. So this line here, this ledger line, would be A. What's one letter forward from A if we were to go one more step up? Well, that's easy. That should be B, right? So this note here is B. Okay? So we have C, E, G, and B. Okay? So we're finally in root position. So now we need to put this in third inversion. Third inversion involves a second on the bottom, a third in the middle, and a third on top. Well, I see an easy fix already. What if I moved this high B, way above the staff, back down to the middle? What I just did was I created a second on the bottom without touching any of the other notes, and I'm still using the letters that I need to be using. I have to use the letters C, E, G, and B, right? So all I did was move the B down to a lower version of B. Same letter, so that works. And now that we did that, I don't need that ledger line anymore, so I'm going to erase that ledger line. And let's double check. We have a second on the bottom between B and C. Do we have a third in the middle? Yep. Between C and E, there's a third. Do we have a third above that? Yep, because between E and G, there's a third. So we have a 7 chord in third inversion, a C7 chord. Okay? And that means number 4 is correct. All right, and then you'll find out what your extra credit is. So this is a little trickier than last week's assignment, but it's not that much different. The only difference is we're dealing with more notes than usual. So each chord now has 4 notes in it instead of 3. And that means you're dealing with 3 intervals per chord instead of just 2 intervals per chord. So it's going to take you a tiny bit longer, but not that much, okay? If you have any questions, feel free to send me a private comment on Google Classroom, or you can simply send me an email. Now, keep in mind, you're not going to simply copy this on your Jamboard, because when you get your assignment, these letters up here are going to be different. So I don't want you to just copy what you see here. You have to actually read the directions carefully and make sure you're creating the right chords based on the right names that are listed here, because I am going to change these names. And once again, I'm going to get rid of these letters, okay? So if you need to watch this video one more time just to kind of refresh your memory a little bit before you try this assignment, please feel free. Otherwise, good luck, and talk to you soon.